Hello, this is the third of a series of 4 podcasts that looks at Nazi family policy. The first 2 are focused on women. What we're going to do here is we're going to focus in on youth, on children. And this first podcast will look at Nazi aims towards the children. Okay, so we'll start off with focusing in on the purpose of education, why it was important to Hitler, why he felt that he needed to take control over the minds of young people. Okay, just to give a little bit of context then, the generation of adults of 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, to a large extent Hitler wrote them off as people that he would never be able to get to passionately follow Nazism. Okay, they may passively follow his ideas. He could use propaganda, he could use terror, a mixture of those 2 methods to get the German people to follow him, to get the German adults to follow him. But he would never really get the passion that he wanted. Why not? Because the adults had grown up in a time, they had been educated in a time when the Nazis didn't control schools. So therefore their ideas had already been tainted by thoughts such as war was bad, etc., etc. Now the children, on the other hand, Hitler saw as a sort of, in a sense, a bit like a blank sheet of paper ready to be written on. If he could get control of their thoughts, the way they think at a very, very early age, then by the time they reached adulthood, they would passionately believe in Nazi ideas. Okay, so ultimately, Hitler really focused in on the children. Remember, Hitler's long-term aims, such as war for living space, he wasn't seriously planning that to happen for at least 7 or 8 years after he came to power in 1933. So therefore, just doing the maths for that, 10-year-old children, for example, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, would reach the age of 18 by the early 1940s. So Hitler really focused in on children. Okay, it was all about making Germany strong. To be fit and healthy. We looked at that last lesson. Okay, so he, in a sense, is taking control of children even before they're born, because he is encouraging the selection of men and women to select racially healthy partners so that the children they have are racially pure. So the basic view is that girls will grow up to be wives and mothers, with in the previous podcast and revision session. Their main role in life is to have babies for Hitler, in a sense, have babies for the Reich, ideally as many as possible, and of course the babies should be racially pure babies, and boys will grow up to be soldiers in the broader sense. Many of them will be actual soldiers. Of course, not everybody can be a soldier, but the mentality of soldiers. Okay, so boys who grow up to take public office, to become leaders, or to be leaders of the economy, ultimately it's all about preparing for war. So business leaders, their role would be to run factories to make weapons, etc., etc. So the purpose of education, Hitler said, was to create Nazis. Now remember, in 1933, 44% of Germans voted for the Nazis, 56 didn't, but even more to the point, even a smaller proportion of Germans actually joined the Nazi Party. Probably on balance, throughout Hitler's rule, maybe 1 in 10 Germans were members of the Nazi Party. But in his long-term vision, that obviously was to expand. So ultimately, in 20, 30, 40 years, Hitler envisioned the vast majority of Germans being Nazis. Okay, so a few details then. Schooling was taken control of. All lessons began with the Heil Hitler salute. Okay, so it's very important, incidentally, when you write about this, if you get a question on this in the exam, this is quite likely, and you do choose it. I made this point at the revision session. You've got to pack your answers with precise information. Too often candidates think, oh, this is easy, and they talk in very general terms about education, so you've got to be very, very precise in the details that you give. So the next few slides will take you through some of those. Okay, so for example, the textbook, so you mention it, makes your answers stand out. The person in charge of education, you can see him here, called Bernhard Rust. He was the Nazi Minister for Education. So he very quickly, after Hitler took power in 1933, got to work. Remember, the Enabling Act allowed Hitler to pass laws without going to the Reichstag, so a series of laws were quickly passed that changed education. So all children went to school until the age of 14. That may seem low by today's standards, but certainly in those days that was pretty much the norm. But it was compulsory that you had to go to school, and all schools had the same curriculum. Again, that may seem surprising by today's standards because we have a national curriculum, but in those days, the whole idea of the school, of the government controlling education, was very unusual. All schools ran their own curriculum, but not for the Nazis. They set up a national curriculum, and they insisted that PE had 15% of the lesson time. The reason why, of course, PE is about developing physical skills, and physical skills were very, very important for the Nazis. If you were a boy, you're learning to become a hardened warrior, so you had to be physically fit. But more to the point, in PE lessons, you had to learn team skills, because in the army, a soldier in an army unit has got to work as part of a team. So PE lessons, big focus on team skills rather than individual athletics. That was very much discouraged. Individual athletics Hitler didn't like because he saw that as encouraging selfishness, people thinking for themselves, whereas this is all about thinking for the wider group, the collective. So other lessons, there were what we call race studies, where they were taught Aryan superiority. Jews, for example, would be taken to the front of the classroom, Jewish children, and humiliated. They would have the shapes of their noses measured and drawn. In the next podcast session, in the next revision session, we will look at Jewish policy, and we'll point out that basically by the mid-1930s, Jews had their own schools, but certainly in the first couple of years of Hitler's rule, Jews were humiliated in such lessons as race studies. Another lesson that they had, and it's not written there, was what we call sorry, let's spell that correctly, is what you call eugenics. Okay, which was a lesson in which they learned about the importance of breeding and cross-selective breeding, and selecting appropriate partners so that you're developing the strong racial characteristics from one generation to the next. Okay, so boys had a slightly different curriculum from the girls. The big focus on science and then maths. Maths lessons, for example, all of the activities would have a propaganda message in them. So they would learn about, the speeds of aeroplanes dropping bombs and the bomb trajectories and things like that. And there'd be maths problems, but they'd be very subtly conditioning their brains to think that war was normal. Okay. Girls learned to sew and to cook, for the reasons we've said, their roles were domestic. From 1935, all textbooks had to be Nazi approved. Okay, so and new ones were full of Nazi propaganda. So, for example, history textbooks were rewritten. Battles that Germany had lost would be taken out. Battles that Germany won would be given greater emphasis, etc. So it's all about making you proud of German history. Teachers were brought under control. Remember, and I'll just put this in for you, there was an organisation that had been formed even before 1933 called the NLB, the Lehrerbund. Lehrer is the German word for teachers. And all teachers had to join the Nazi Party. If they didn't join, then you would lose your job. And if you didn't promote Nazi values in the classroom, then you would lose your job. Okay, you would probably find the students would report you to their Hitler Youth leader, and you would be caught out. So there's a bit about history books that we mentioned. There's race studies, as we mentioned, and eugenics. We promoted anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews. Finally, on this podcast, the Nazis also created 3 types of special schools. Now, these focused on the children who were identified as being the best of the best, so who had the qualities to become future leaders in the future. So the very best children were creamed off effectively. They didn't go to mainstream schools, and there were 3 types of special schools for future leaders. Okay, so the first type were called the Adolf Hitler schools, and they were for future party leaders, for future members of the Nazi Party. Then there were the Nappelers, which were the schools for future army leaders, the leaders, soldiers who would become leaders. And then there were the Ordensbergen, or the Orders of the Castle, which were for future SS leaders. Now remember, the SS were the black shirts. They were the Nazi police, not the secret police. Remember, the secret police were the Gestapo. The SS were originally the protection squads, Hitler's bodyguards, but after the Night of the Long Knives, remember, they were the executioners on the Night of the Long Knives. They became independent, and ultimately they took over the German police. So they were very public, the black shirts. Now, to become a member of the SS, you had to be racially pure. Okay, they were the model of what Germany would look like, say, in 50 years' time. After all, the racial cleansing had happened. So therefore, to become a member of the SS, you had to prove your pure ancestry going back 200 years. So the most racially pure children were identified as future SS leaders, and they were sent to special schools called the Orders of the Castle, which were usually based in castles in the countryside. Remember, I think we have mentioned that Nazi ideas promoted what we call blood and soil, that the best values came from nature, being close to the countryside. And it was very much a sort of like survival of the fittest type of ethos, type of attitude that the Nazis had in these schools, these Ordensbergen. So these children were taught to be utterly ruthless, and they were drilled, and they were brainwashed, and a tiny proportion would lose their lives. I mean, there were incidents because PE activities actually used live ammunition and tanks, for example, because they were being prepared for that really, really key future role. Okay, so that's the end of this podcast. I hope that was useful for you. We'll move on to the 4th podcast, which will look at leisure activities, the life of children outside schools. Thank you.